Would you ask Mr. Ledsome to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Ledsome,
Yes.
ready to carry on?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ledsome, were you aware in 2013 that Brian Martin had been one of the authors of the guidance in Section 12 of Approved Document B as it then stood?
I think, well, I probably would have been because he was the fire safety professional at the time of the approved document was produced.
The 2006 edition?
Yes.
Yes. Did you ever consider the possibility that Brian Martin was unable to be objective about the terms of guidance in Approved Document B and about any criticisms or shortcomings in it?
No, not at all.
No. Now let's turn to the second recommendation of the coroner, CLG 401870.
Yes.
And you can see there the second bullet point down, which is to review ADB to see that it's expressed in words and adopts a format, as it said, which are intelligible to the wide range of people and bodies engaged in construction, maintenance and refurbishment of buildings, and not just to professionals who may already have a depth of knowledge of building regulations and building control matters. Now, can you confirm, was it your understanding that that recommendation was accepted or rejected?
Well, we had already realised and appreciated the need to revise the format of the approved documents. We had a programme of work, and we expected, or the way we approached this was to, when we got round to the review of ADB, put it into that new style which we had sort of originally piloted with what was in fact the new approved document case. So I would regard that recommendation as being accepted.
Right. Now let's look at the submission that got sent to Don Foster. Again, can we do the same exercise?
Sure.
Have that up on the screen at the same time. It's CLG 401871. Page 1, paragraph 4. And there it is. Now, this time on the right-hand side.
Yes.
And I've read this to you before. Could you confirm of these three subparagraphs A, B, or C, which subparagraph relates to the second of the coroner's recommendations there in the second bullet point on the left?
It would be the subparagraph C and the final sentence. So what we're talking about there is the new easy-to-read style guide, which we, as I say, we'd already piloted in the approved documents produced in 2013 or at the end of 2012.
Right.
And that's indeed what we did with the plain English review, which we commissioned REBA to do approved document B in 2015.
Right. So not A, C.
So C.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, by adopting C, as it were, or taking that approach in C, then perhaps also, at the very least, it would help with A.
Right. Did you agree with A?
Sorry, acknowledge that the guidance in approved document B can be difficult for inexperience. Yes, that was, I could understand why that might be the case.
Right. What did you mean, or what did the department mean in the submission to Mr. Foster of inexperienced people?
Well, I think what we're talking about there are people who would not be fire safety professionals, for example, or fire engineers. So, for example, a building owner or someone, a sort of general builder who may not be have detailed understanding and knowledge of fire safety matters.
Right. So by that answer, were you agreeing, or did you, as a department, accept that approved document B, as it stood, was difficult for the wide range of people and bodies engaged in the construction industry to apply, not only professionals?
Well, I mean, there's always, sorry, I'm going to be a bit discursive here. Well, we have to think very carefully about the audience for a document like that, and how far, in terms of simplifying it, you reduce it to a level which is actually no use to anyone because it's just a set of sort of general statements, and how far it does need to go into detail about quite technical matters, and so it was yes, of course, it was a challenging document to read, and I would find it a very challenging document to read as a layperson. So yes, I would accept that it would have been a challenging document for an average builder, for example, to read. But on the other hand, given that the builder is the responsible person for ensuring compliance with the regulations, if they don't understand it, they should be talking to someone who does.
Yes, but do you agree that simplification and clarification aren't always the same thing?
They can be different, yes.
Yes, and that ideally one wants to have a document that is as simple as possible without compromising its technical integrity on the one hand, whilst making it as crystal clear to the reader.
That's absolutely the ideal of any technical document.
But the point I think the coroner was making is what I think you were accepting, which was that there is a wide range, or was a wide range of people and bodies out there, not only professionals, who needed to understand and use ADB, but for whom the guidance was not sufficiently easy to apply.
Well, I think I would accept if people were saying that the document could be improved in terms of clarity. Of course, I would accept that.
Can we go to Anthony Bird's statement, please, at CLG 30194661, page 19, paragraph 46. And at the end of the paragraph on that page, he says this. He says, I should, however, add here that it is important to note that the approved documents are technical documents and therefore will never be considered accessible reading for all. They're designed, as I've set out above, to be read, interpreted and applied by technically competent people in the industry who are familiar with the functional requirements of the regulations that underpin them. Do you agree with what Mr. Bird says there, that the approved documents were designed to be used by technically competent people in the industry, familiar with the functional requirements of the regulations?
Yeah, I would agree with that statement.
Right. Did you therefore agree with the coroner that there was a wide range of people and bodies engaged in construction, maintenance, refurbishment of buildings who were required to use and to understand ADB, not only professionals who may already have a depth of knowledge in building and building control matters?
Well, people undertaking building work of whatever nature, of course, would be expected to be aware of what they needed to do to comply with the regulations, and using the relevant approved document guidance appropriately in so doing. For something like this, fire safety, particularly if there's a particularly complex fire safety issue, then, as I said, if they were not or did not feel confident in understanding what was required of them, then they should take competent advice.
So was it your view, in agreement with Mr. Bird, that in fact that the readership of ADB was not the wide range of people and bodies engaged in the construction industry, not limited to professionals, but technically competent people, whatever that means?
Well, I mean, the approved documents guidance, as I said, is there to help those with duties under the regulations achieve compliance, and there will be a wide range of duty holders through from the white van man, if I may use that term, through to designers, architects, etc. It is always and always would be a very difficult job to try and draft an approved document to try and cover both of those audiences. With something like approved document B, and this is how I read what Mr. Bird is saying here, we needed to ensure that the guidance provided the guidance for those engaged in providing advice, designs, etc., to be able to understand what they needed to ensure their clients, or if they were doing the work themselves, they themselves needed to do to achieve compliance.
Well, you say that if they were doing the work themselves, that's the point, isn't it? That somebody with a high-rise, for example, I don't know if there are many people with high-rises, but if they were, might decide they didn't want to spend that much money on professionals and do it themselves. Was that person who didn't want to engage a safety engineer or an architect, but had sufficient design expertise themselves, or thought they did, was that person the readership to whom these documents were aimed?
Well, if that person was decided to do that, then if they're not going to take account of the approved document, then presumably they would be going to do something different from the approved document guidance, which of course they are entitled to do, which of course then building control needs to sign off, so they need to have that discussion with building control about what they're proposing to do is not in line with the approved document, but it meets the relevant functional requirement because of A, B and C. And if they're going to get that, have a positive outcome from that discussion with building control, then they've obviously got to be able to demonstrate to building control that they know what they're talking about.
Right. I mean, my example was perhaps a bit extreme, but does it come to this, that there was a tension between the coroner's expectations of clarity and simplicity so as to allow a wide readership to access the approved documents on the one hand, and what Mr. Bird is saying here, with which you agree, on the other?
Well, obviously I can't and should not try and put, second guess what was in the coroner's mind when she made that recommendation. But clearly, the word I would use is balance. If the word you wish to use is tension, then I would accept, yes, there is that need for balance, there is that tension, there is that challenge. The other, in terms of providing clear guidance and making sure that in terms of simplifying, putting into more layperson's language or terms, for example, you then do not lose the substance of what's needed in a particularly technical area. The other aspect to this, of course, is that industry bodies themselves may produce their own guidance in terms of how their membership, for example, may need to comply with the requirements. So that there's that aspect to it as well.
Now, let's look back at the submission.
Yes.
CLG 401871, page 2, paragraph 9. Under considerations, it says this: at the inquest, it was acknowledged that the fencer scheme did not extend to certification of the wall panels, and that the panels themselves did not meet the guidance given in approved document B. Unfortunately, the expert witness appointed to advise the inquest gave confused and conflicting evidence on what was required by building regulations at the time. This was to some extent due to the process of cross-examination, and it became necessary for me to give evidence to clarify the situation. Now, the me there is Brian Martin.
Correct.
He signs this document.
Yes, he gave evidence.
See from page 4. Now, I just want to focus on the part of that paragraph after the words "unfortunately," and then go on to the next paragraph, and then I'll ask a question. Given the confusion in court, it's unsurprising that the coroner has criticised the clarity of the guidance in approved document B and has called for it to be made clearer. Now, were you told that one of the experts instructed to advise the coroner, who was a chartered surveyor from RICS by the name of David Walker, misunderstood the guidance in ADB when giving evidence to the inquest?
Well, I was certainly told and knew that Mr. Martin had been asked to give evidence to the coroner's inquest to help clarify the application and interpretation of the building regulations as they would have applied to the refurbishment work, and that was my recollection, is that Mr. Martin wasn't originally asked to provide expert witness advice, but then because of the way the inquest unfolded, he was then asked to provide that expert witness advice, testimony.
Right. Did you believe that the confusion and conflicting evidence was due simply to the process of cross-examination, as opposed to a problem inherent in the regulations?
Well, I don't know and I cannot recall exactly what may have given rise to the confusion as to whether, as you say, it was in the process of cross-examination or how far it might have been based on the evidence that Mr. Walker gave in relation to ADB 2000.
Now, taking the sentence in paragraph 9, which starts with the word unfortunately, and going into the second sentence of paragraph 10, those are, in a sense, statements of fact about what happened at the inquest, together with a little bit of description by Brian Martin. Did he tell you himself anything of what we see in those two paragraphs before you saw this submission?
Well, I would have been aware of the issues, of course, because I would have been aware that Mr. Martin had been asked to give expert witness at the time.
Did what Mr. Martin told you and did what Mr. Martin wrote on the page here lead you to disregard or take less seriously the criticism by the coroner about the clarity of ADB?
No, I don't think that we are disregarding the recommendation made by the coroner that ADB, about her criticism of the clarity of the ADB guidance. There was the issue which we discussed before lunch as to whether the particular ADB guidance that was being referred to was the 2000 version, though I fully accept that she was sort of looking forward. But I don't see a contradiction between what is being said here and the way in which we've then recommended to Lord Foster how we should approach that particular recommendation.
Did you yourself read the transcript to check for yourself whether Brian Martin, what Brian Martin is saying is correct about the process of cross-examination, and to make sure that it wasn't Brian Martin himself who had exacerbated the confusion?
No, I did not.
Did you interrogate Mr. Martin about why he thought that the process of cross-examination had confused the inquest's expert?
Well, it was discussed with Mr. Martin.
Did you ask him? Did you test whether it was fair to blame the expert in this way?
Well, I don't recall saying, posing a question in quite that way. I mean, I can't remember the exact circumstances in which Mr. Martin was asked to provide expert witness testimony, but clearly someone, presumably the coroner, felt that it was necessary to have the department's expert provide testimony. That would have been a decision for the coroner, not for Mr. Martin to say, right, I'm going to turn up to provide expert testimony. So there must have been something happening in the way that the inquest developed, which led the coroner to ask for Mr. Martin to provide testimony.
Mr. Martin may have been the department's expert, but he wasn't independent, was he? Not least because he drafted the approved document B, or at least the amendments in 2006.
Well, I think the coroner would have felt, quite rightly so, that this is a government publication. So let's ask the government what they think is around about this document.
Yes. Did you? Sorry, I'm so sorry.
So absolutely. So very reasonable request, and in these circumstances, we would immediately, obviously, accede, and we would say we will be able to help you by providing, our expert, our technical expert, Mr. X or whoever, to provide expert witness testimony. I mean, it doesn't happen, obviously, very often, but I'm sure there would have been other occasions when the department may have been asked to provide expert witness testimony in this sort of way. It's not a completely unique circumstance.
Did you yourself interrogate the question whether the confusion in court had arisen from the evidence and the way it had come out, on the one hand, as opposed to something inherently confusing in the regulatory document, approved document B?
Well, when we discussed it, and as I say, it was both with, Mr. Bird would have been involved in those discussions as well. My understanding was that the coroner's inquest and therefore the testimony had been focused on what was understood by the 2000 version, which had led to the situation where Mr. Martin was then asked to give expert witness testimony. Now, as I say, quite how it was felt that confusion arose, I'm afraid I can't say.
Did you give any thought to the possibility that David Walker, as the expert from RICS called to advise the inquest, was fairly representative of those in the profession, those in the industry?
Well, I can't comment on Mr. Walker's credentials. Clearly, if he was appointed by the inquest, he had absolutely the right credentials to fulfil that role. All I can say is that clearly it was felt, as the inquest unfolded, that the view of the government was needed to clarify what was emerging from the relevant witness evidence, and therefore Mr. Martin was asked, or we offered Mr. Martin to provide that evidence, that expert evidence.
Yes. Does that tell us that you at least had understood that the profession or industry, if you like, or some segment of it at least, was labouring under a confusion about the meaning and effect of this part of approved document B? Well,
clearly, if there was if an expert like Mr. Walker was or it's felt that there was a need for another expert other than Mr. Walker to give evidence, then clearly there was obviously there were some issues with that particular guidance, which was the as I understand the 2000 version of ADB.
Now, can we look at paragraph 4C of the submission on page 1? If we can go back to the previous page. That says, set out the government's intentions to issue a revised approved document B in 2016 to 17, following a full review of the fire safety aspects of building regulations. This would use the department's new style guide for easy-to-read approved documents and take account of current research, which is due to deliver in 2015. Now, when you said, or Mr. Martin said, with your blessing, 2016 to 17, what was meant? What was meant by 2016/17?
Well, I think it's reasonable to assume that we were thinking about the financial year 2016-17.
Yes, I see. So would that mean a deadline of the 31st of March 2017?
Well, an expectation that it would be done by then, yes.
We say an expectation. Yes,
yes.
I see. So for 2016/17, we should read 31st of March 2017.
Yes.
Right. Now that was almost exactly 4 years after the recommendation made by the coroner, wasn't it?
Yes.
Were you concerned about that period of time?
Well, as I said before lunch, we looked at this in the context of that we needed to review much of ADB anyway. There were the issues that we were researching. There was the fact that in the normal course of events, a review of ADB would be needed, and a reasonable timescale for that review, taking account of the research which I mentioned, and other things suggested to us that an end date for that review of 2016-17 was reasonable. And that's why we suggested that in the submission. We discussed before lunch whether we could have taken out a specific revision of Chapter 12. We didn't. I explained why. I explained that that wouldn't have been necessarily a straightforward exercise. It would have taken some time. It wouldn't have. We'd still had to go through the regulatory hoops, etc., which we've discussed. But I accept, with hindsight, we could have offered that as a possibility to the Minister, explained the implications of so doing, so that he could have then taken a view as to which of those two options he would recommend. We didn't do that, and I take responsibility as if that is regarded as something we should have done.
Now, let's go to his witness statement. This is CLG 3019471 for Lord Pickles. And if we go to page 17 in Lord Pickles' statement, paragraph 56, he says, and this is about this submission, in the last third of the paragraph, there's a sentence that starts, "I recollect," you see?
Yes.
And he says, "I recollect querying the timescale at a meeting with the Permanent Secretary and being informed that the research was substantial and that the issues were complex, which was why the revision date was as projected. Minister stated that the intention was that it would be published in an easier-to-read style, albeit would necessarily still contain technical material." Now, were you aware yourself that Lord Pickles, the Minister, had queried the timescale?
No.
You weren't?
No. Well, I do not recall it. Whether it was mentioned to me at the time, I don't remember. I think I would remember it if it had been.
Right. Can you account for why that query didn't come back down to you?
Because I would imagine, obviously, the Secretary of State would have had regular meetings with the Permanent Secretary, and this obviously was something which Lord Pickles wished to check with the Permanent Secretary. Quite right. Quite right. Obviously, because it was an important point, and the Permanent Secretary, replied in the way that he did. That is all I can assume from that description in Lord Pickles' statement.
Now, we saw that the submission went up to Don Foster, dated the 11th of April.
Correct.
2013. If we go to CLG 50485, if you look at the second email down on the page, here is an email from Don Foster to Brian Martin, copied among other people, you and Anthony Bird.
Yep.
Brian, DF, and it's dated the 15th of April 2013. Brian, DF, a senior sub, and agrees to all recommendations in para 4. So the agreement came pretty quickly.
It did.
Yes. Now, can we turn on a month to May 2013 and the submission to Lord Pickles? We know that advice about how to respond to the Lacknell House coroner was agreed, collated and submitted to Lord Pickles, Eric Pickles, for approval on the 13th of May. I'll just show you one document, HOM 404397. And here's an email which fixes the date, Monday the 13th of May 2013. PSTA submission covering a draft Secretary of State response, Annex B, to the Rule 43 sent by the coroner. Now, if we now turn to your statement at page 46, paragraph 177, you say there, on 13th of May 2013, I was copied into a submission by Louise Upton regarding a draft reply from the Secretary of State to the coroner's Rule 43 recommendations following the Lacknell House inquest. The submission set out the various responses as set out in the submissions to individual ministers and annexed. I do not recall seeing or commenting on the submission in draft, but it reflected the advice previously supplied to Don Foster on the issues for which we were responsible. Now, if we go back to the submission itself, please, if we can go to the document at HOM 404403, I'll show you the first page of that before we go into the middle of it. Here is the response from Louise Upton to the Secretary of State, 13th of May 2013, that was attached to her email of that day, as we've seen. If we go, please, to page 4, we can see on page 4 paragraph 17. And this is under the heading on page 3, we don't need to go back to it, building regulations. And what is said at paragraph 17 is, a full review of the approved document would require significant resources and have a disruptive effect on the construction industry. Instead, we propose to seek confirmation from Fencer and other scheme providers for replacement windows to ensure that their members are fully aware of the scope of the schemes and the requirements applicable to their work. We would aim to complete this by the end of the summer, without the need for the department to divert significant resources. The department has also commissioned research intended to feed into a future edition of approved document. This work is due complete in 2015, and we expect that a revised approved document B could be published during 2016-17. Now, the words have a disruptive effect on the construction industry. Those words there, it appears from the documents we have that they were added by Brian Martin on the 8th of May 2013. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Let me show you a document to make that good if I can. CLG 50559. And if we turn on in that document, please, to paragraph 17, which we'll find on page 4. In fact, it's the whole of the paragraph, and indeed the surrounding paragraphs that are added. Take it from me, comes from Brian Martin.
Okay.
Did you agree with the addition of those words within that paragraph as a rationale for not having a full review?
I cannot recollect if I saw Mr. Martin's proposed amendments. I mean, you may have evidence that I was involved in an email chain. I just do not recall.
Right. Do you know how a full review of ADB might have a disruptive effect on the construction industry, as Mr. Martin has suggested?
Well, I think that what Mr. Martin would be alluding to there would be the fact that any major change to an approved document, particularly if there were significant technical changes in terms of standards to be achieved or ways of demonstrating compliance, would inevitably entail quite a significant familiarisation process for the industry. Which could, I mean, disruptive is perhaps, if I were writing this, not a word I would have used, but would have had an effect on the construction industry. And I know that some changes, for example, to approved documents in earlier years, there had been quite a bit of concern about the effects of major changes and how they were, and the impacts on industry. So I think that is probably what Mr. Martin was getting at when he used that expression.
Do you recall that in 2005, well, between 2004 and 2006, there had been a full review and a consultation on the changes to ADB?
Well, I'm aware of that, yes.
Yeah, had that led to disruption in the construction industry?
I don't know, because I wasn't around at the time.
Why would it be disruptive to the industry to receive a document, particularly in relation to fire safety, that guided them with clarity and accessibility about what they could and couldn't do?
Well, as I said, if the document, as well as providing that clarity and simplicity, was introducing new ways of demonstrating compliance, new standards, for example, then that is inevitably going to have some impact on the industry. There is, at the very least, the need to familiarise themselves with the new guidance, and if there are significant new approaches which are being set out in the approved document, then the industry would need to adapt accordingly.
Isn't that always the case, even in relation to cyclical reviews?
Well, that is always an issue, which is why we often have very significant transitional periods for changes to approved documents or regulations.
This was an area of the UK economy, wasn't it, in respect of which the government was trying to reduce the burden of regulation and stimulate economically.
Yes.
And as we've seen, your department was a deregulating department and was proud of the fact, or at least wanted to make sure that the Star Chamber knew of it. Yes.
It wanted to make sure that the Star Chamber knew of it, yes.
Right. That's a fair distinction. And how much was the department's reticence to launch a full review, as reflected in the words on the page in red here, linked to those concerns, to those ambitions?
Well, there are a number of aspects to this. So one aspect I think would have been influential, would be not having sort of piecemeal. I'm going to use the term piecemeal, but I don't want that to be taken in any sort of dismissive sense, but sort of individual changes to bits of an approved document every year or every 18 months. So there's a drip feed of changes, and everyone is having to get used to another change to the approved document. So that's why we felt it was the best approach was to conduct this as a single formal review, which indeed is what was the original intention of the Future of Building Control review proposals in 2008. So that would be a way of trying to minimise that transitional and familiarisation upheaval that I would be talking about. And clearly, I would not argue that a succession of changes happening rapidly, perhaps in what to the outside world may seem to be quite an incoherent way, would be disruptive to that industry. And that was something that we wished to avoid. And that's why, as I said, we thought the best approach would be to do a big bang, sorry, that's the wrong term, do a full review of approved document B, recognising that would take the period of time set out in the advice we gave to ministers.
And even though that wasn't something that the coroner had asked you to do?
It was not something that the coroner had asked us to do, no, but we had other things that we felt, or we were starting to think needed to be done with approved document B.
And even though doing a full review would plunge you straight into the exercise of one in, by this stage, two out, and the red tape challenge.
Well, it wouldn't have plunged us into the red tape challenge because that was existing stock of regulation, but we'd have had to go through the one in, two out hurdles clearly. But again, we probably felt, if I had thought about it at the time, I would have been concerned that doing a piecemeal review. In fact, no, we did think about this because this was a conscious decision. And I was concerned that if we undertook piecemeal reviews of ADB, A, the disruptive effect that I talked about, B, that we actually could be more difficult to get through some of the regulatory hurdles because this would be a self-standing change which we would need to justify in its own right, and we wouldn't be able to claim, deregulation elsewhere in the building regulations to help get through that. And C, I had to be cognizant of the resources available in my team and the other priorities which my team were being given at that point in time to come to a view about what met the intention of the coroner's recommendations clearly, what would enable us to deal with the Part B issues in the round, and achieve an outcome that would sort of help as best we could met all of those various different imperatives.
And is everything you've just said the totality of the factors that went into the thinking?
Well, I think I provide somewhere in my witness statement a sort of quite an extensive rationale for the timetable, which I do have my witness statement here. I obviously don't want to refer to it outside of documents on the screen, but I do set out in my witness statement somewhere quite a list of which, and I may well have missed things which I put in my witness statement from what I've just said to you.
You see, what you've just given us doesn't include life safety, and this being recommendations arising out of an inquest in which 6 people died.
Well, clearly we were wanting to ensure that what we were doing was ensuring that approved document B, the new version of approved document B, addressed all of the various issues that we were identifying, all of which had a potential life safety aspect to them.
But did life safety play any part in the time frame selected, 31st of March 2017?
Well, I mean, obviously, at the back of our mind, all the time, we were thinking about, well, what can we do to ensure that ADB is fit for purpose for the future, and that was the whole purpose of doing the review of ADB.
Well, isn't your answer just now the point? It was at the back of your mind, wasn't at the front of your minds.
Well, we were looking to see what we could do within the parameters which I have described to deal with and improve approved document B. And of course, we wanted to ensure that approved document B gave the best guidance on this on these matters. Now, as I said, and we discussed before lunch, there was an issue about how far some of the immediate problems with the 2000 version had been dealt with in the 2006 version, and I was advised that that had gone some way, perhaps, to dealing with the coroner's worries. But we accepted that we needed to do more, and that was why we certainly said that we must we will take forward the review of ADB.
I mean, is the reality that in framing the ultimate delivery date for this whole scale of review of approved document B and any revisions to it, you allowed yourself to be overwhelmed and distracted by the complexity and the size of the task, and lost sight of the fact that, in fact, what the coroner wanted was a response which went to life safety?
Well,
you lost sight of that.
I do not accept that we lost sight of life safety. I do accept, as I discussed and said before lunch and have reiterated after lunch, that we, and I take account, I was part of this, we, looking back, could, I'll leave others today judge whether should, have thought, well, is there an option to do something sooner with that particular part of approved document B? And yes, I accept that, and I regret that perhaps we should have given it more attention and we didn't.
Very well. Now let's look at Lord Pickle's response and the commitment made. We can find his response to the coroner at CLG 402788. And we can see there a letter of the 20th of May 2013. Dear Madam.
Yes.
And if you turn to page 2, starting with the word finally, in the penultimate paragraph, he says this: finally, in relation to building regulations, I've noted your concerns about the difficulties that some of those involved in the inquest had with the interpretation of approved document B. I can assure you that my department is committed to a programme of simplification. However, the design of fire protection in buildings is a complex subject and should remain to some extent in the realm of professionals. We've commissioned research which will feed into a future review of this part of the building regulations. We expect this work to form the basis of a formal review, leading to the publication of a new edition of the approved document in 2016/17. The revision would be drafted in accordance with the new style guide for approved documents, aimed at ensuring that the guidance is capable of being more easily understood and the need to cross-reference is reduced. In the meantime, however, I have commissioned my officials to review the current guidance issued by providers of competent person schemes for window installers. The review is intended to ensure that members of these schemes are fully aware of the scope of these schemes and the fire safety measures which should be addressed, and is, I believe, an appropriate response to the problems that came to light during the inquests. I'm grateful for your recommendations and can assure you of my commitment to ensuring that the safety of residents in high-rise buildings continues to be a priority. Now, I put that there for you. Let's now look and see what the department says in its opening submissions at this part of the inquiry. So can we go back to those, please? CLG 3036387, page 34. And if we go, I'm so sorry, page 32. And if we go back to page 32, please, paragraph 96 and 97. I want to focus on 97, but if you want to look at 96, that is the background to it. 97 says this: the advice that was sent to ministers and the Secretary of State's subsequent response to the coroner failed to articulate clearly that the work was not considered to be safety critical, or to explain how and why this view had been reached. Without this information, the response to the coroner was ambiguous as to whether the recommendation was accepted in full as safety critical. And this may have been the reason why, in turn, the coroner did not challenge or seek to correct any misunderstanding in the department's response. Do you agree that the response was ambiguous as to whether the recommendation was accepted in full?
Can I go back to the response, please?
Certainly. CLG 402788, page 2. You may need to go over to page 3, depending on what you want to show us.
Yeah. So, what the draft is saying, reading it now, is that yes, we will do a formal review of ADB to the date provided. That as part of that, we would undertake the new style, so that would hopefully improve the clarity and presentation of the approved document. The first sentence of the paragraph at the bottom of the letter refers to research which will feed into a future review. I mean, looking at it now, yes, it could have said, and the approach we propose is to wrap up the proposed changes which you've recommended as part of that review. That would have been clearly in the draft, in the response sent. I would agree with that.
Would you also agree that the response was ambiguous as to whether the recommendation was accepted in full as safety critical?
Well, the recommendation, I mean, we do not refer to the term safety critical. I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether that would have been necessary to have said that in the response or not.
He made no reference in his letter to the coroner's recommendation that ADB be clarified with particular regard to the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building, did he? We haven't seen any reference in...
No, he didn't say that.
No. Why was that?
Well, with this response, I mean, I cannot recall exactly, so I'm slightly trying to think what may have been in the minds when the reply was drafted and approved and sent. That certainly what the coroner was recommending vis-a-vis the need to make those changes to the approved document B would be encompassed within the formal review which we've discussed. It probably was not felt necessary to spell out explicitly that would include changes to guidance related to requirement B4. I can only think that it was felt that was slightly, if we are going to look at ADB and a full review of ADB, then obviously that would include requirement B4 without it needing to have been spelled out. That's a little bit of an assumption there, but I think that's possibly plausible.
Right. Right. Who drafted this document? Mr. Pickles, as he then was, his response to the coroner.
Well, there was a collective effort in the first place, because obviously the response, as you know, covers a number of elements. So we would have contributed, and Mr. Martin, I think, probably would have done the drafts to a draft which would then have been coordinated and collated, I presume, by Louise Upton, who put it up with the advice to the Secretary of State. Now, whether there was any sort of overall editing done to ensure that all the various bits hung together in a coherent letter, I'm sorry, I don't know.
Who would have had final approval, apart from the Secretary of State himself before he sent it, or it was sent on his behalf, but who before him in the process would have had final approval?
Well, I think if I recall, there was a reference in the covering submission that the submission was cleared by Louise Upton as Deputy Director, so my opposite number on the fire safety side. So that's the first point I would make. Subsequent to my witness statement, I've also had my attention drawn or realised or found that I do believe that the director of the Fire and Emergencies Directorate, so i.e. Dawn Eastmead's boss, did wish to discuss the response or the proposed approach to the response prior to it going to the Secretary of State. Now, I don't know whether that involved going through a draft and ticking off a draft, but I'm certainly aware that I think Mr. O'Connor obviously wanted to know what was being proposed across the piece.
And that had to do with things outside your department's remit, did it?
No, it covered everything. I mean, the first point is that this was obviously, at this point in time, the Fire and Emergencies Division was part of the department, so we were all the same department. But
I meant your department rather than the department.
Yeah, my division.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from memory, parts of the recommendations were needed to be dealt with by the Fire and Emergencies Directorate because they were to do with operational firefighting matters. There was our bit. There was also recommendations there which were dealt with by housing policy, for example.
Yes, I understand.
So that's why there was quite a complex process of involving 3, if not 4, junior ministers in signing off the specific advice. Rightly so, before it went to the Secretary of State, so that he could be assured that his junior ministers had seen this and were comfortable with the advice being provided to him. And that was coordinated overall by the Fire and Emergencies Directorate. And as I say, I'm now aware, I regret I was not aware when I wrote my witness statement, that I believe that Mr. O'Connor met with a number of people to sort of review the approach being taken.
Now, as we can see, there's no reference to the coroner's first recommendation about the spread of fire over the external envelope of the building. Was its absence from this letter due to the fact that Brian Martin considered that the 2006 guidance had dealt with that problem?
I can't answer that question definitively because I wouldn't. It's not a question I would have asked Mr. Martin at the time. As I said, certainly my understanding had been that some of the issues that were causing concerns at the inquest in relation to approved document version 2000 had, I was advised, been addressed in the 2006 version, but that is not to say that it wasn't we would completely say in the next review of approved document B that we didn't need to look at that particular section of the AD. I'm sure we would have done.
Let's turn then to another question, which is the scope of this proposed review. Can we look, please, at CLG 50634? This is an email from Anthony Bird of the 11th of July 2013 to others in the department, including Richard Harrell, Brian Martin, and others, and copied to you,
Yes.
Mr. Ledsome. Subject, our meeting today at 2 p.m. to discuss 2016/17 review. Chaps, we're due to sit down together at 2 p.m. today to discuss the potential scope of the 2016-17 technical review. You see that? Now, did you attend that meeting? Do you think?
I don't know. I think probably not, because I believe that looking at this email, Mr. Bird would have wanted to discuss this with all of his technical team and all of the recipients of this email. They were the technical grade 7s at the time, Mr. Bampton, Mr. Harrell, Mr. Martin and Mr. DeCourt. So this to me says that Mr. Bird wanted to sit down with his senior technical colleagues to, as he says, think about what was needed for the 2016-17 technical review, and this is absolutely what I would have encouraged him to do.
Right. And if you look at the first, one could call it a paragraph, there are two numbers there.
Yeah.
Number 2, what technical parts of the regulations should be included in any 2016/17 review and why?
Yeah.
Did you yourself become involved in discussions about what technical parts of ADB would be included in the review?
Not at this point.
At what point?
Well, as our thinking on what changes needed to be made to the approved documents evolved, then part of that process was to try and identify technical issues across the whole suite of the approved documents might need to be addressed. And there was an exercise on that certainly in later years, 2 or 3, a couple of years after this, I believe, which I know I certainly saw some outcomes from.
Why was the starting point the question, what technical parts of the regulation should be included, as opposed to the coroner's recommendations and the specific parts of approved document B that had been examined at the inquest?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Because obviously I saw this email at the time, and my immediate reaction when you put it up on screen was that it was about the 2016-2017 Part B review. But I'm now reading the penultimate paragraph. Ministers have already shown their hand on Part B, Part L and Part M. So, and because Mr. Bird addressed this to all of the technical team leaders, not simply Mr. Martin, I'm beginning to think that Mr. Bird was looking here for a wider discussion with his technical colleagues about technical issues which may need to be reviewed in a further iteration of technical reviews of approved documents, plural, rather than simply just approved document B. That's what I now read from this.
Right. Did you understand at the time, not perhaps interpreting this document, but from your recollection, whether the technical parts of the regulations to be included included scrutiny of paragraphs 12.6 and 12.7 of approved document B, specifically dealing with the external wall construction?
Well, I wouldn't have, obviously that would have been something that we would need to factor in because of the coroner's recommendation, but in terms of whether there were technical issues associated with that document as opposed to can we improve the drafting, at this point, no, I wouldn't have, no.
No. Can we go to CLG 30189117? This takes us into 2014 now.
Okay.
Second email on page 1 is from Richard Harrell to Brian Martin and you, 4th of February 2014 at 8:57. And he says in that email a couple of thoughts. How does this align with our capacity to update ADB in terms of timescales being flagged to ministers? Do we have ministerial agreement to implement the ADB review? If not, then statements in the sub need to be suitably qualified, ? And then if you look up the page, if we scroll up, you can see there's an email from Brian Martin back to Richard Harrell and to you the same day, about an hour later or so, and he says, in blue, question mark, do we have the ministerial agreement to implement the ADB review, question mark, and then SFS's letter to the coroner after Lakenhall House, and quotes from the 20th of May 2013 letter from the Secretary of State back to the coroner, and then says afterwards, underneath that, we've repeated this line a couple of times since. It's also in Brandon Lewis's speech for Thursday. It's not an absolute commitment. Now, what did you understand Brian Martin to mean there when he said it's not an absolute commitment?
Well, Mr. Harold had obviously just taken up post at the beginning of at this point in time as the successor to Mr. Bird, so I can understand why he was asking about what the proposals were for the review of approved document B, because he wouldn't have been involved in the response to the Lakenhall House inquiry. So that would be the context for this exchange. But I can't. I'm trying to think why Mr. Martin would have said that, because I mean, obviously there was a commitment.
Yeah. And did you understand at the time that there was ministerial agreement to implement the ADB review?
Yes, I did. But as I said, I think it's perfectly legitimate for a new person who's coming in to take on a new portfolio of work with which he's not familiar, given the significant resource issues on his team, to ask the question about exactly what do we need to do. So I think that's a perfectly legitimate question for Mr. Harold to have asked.
Yes, I'm really asking you about Mr. Martin's response when he says it's not an absolute commitment. Is that correct?
Well, the Secretary of State made a commitment clearly.
Correct.
So that was a commitment we should try and meet. So.
Well, he's quoted it in highlight.
Yes.
We expect this work to form the basis of a formal review leading to the publication of a new edition of the approved document in 2016 to 17, and you've told us what that means in date terms, 31st of March 2017.
Yeah.
Now, it then goes on to say it's not an absolute commitment.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Was that correct?
Well, in terms of what we were expecting to do, the commitment was to it was as set out in the Secretary of State's letter, and that obviously trumps any statements that are made.
Well, indeed. So why was it not an absolute commitment?
I don't know why Mr. Martin would have said that.
No. And did you go back to him and ask him, given that you received this email?
I don't know whether it was asked. I asked him that precise question, but certainly, we were working on the basis that we needed to deliver against the commitment made by the Secretary of State.
Were you not concerned to discover that Mr. Martin did not regard the commitment that had been made to the coroner in his 20th of May letter by Eric Pickles as absolute?
Well, I can't comment on why Mr. Martin used that term. All I can say is that in all of the discussions that we were having at that time, and subsequently, we were very, very conscious of the time frame which had been set out in the Secretary of State's response.
And indeed, were you not concerned to discover that your officials in your reporting line, Mr. Martin, took the view that Eric Pickles' commitment to the coroner was less than absolute? Was that not a matter of concern to you?
Well, I mean, as I say, it's difficult for me to understand why Mr. Martin said that, given what was said. He may have been referring to the term "we expect this work to form the basis." I don't know.
Well, let's just there's a prior question. This is now 2014, and a year, almost a year, had passed since Eric Pickles' letter of the 20th of May. Would I be right in thinking that there was as yet no ministerial approval of the proposed review of ADB? Or had there been ministerial approval of the review of ADB by this point?
So we had not put a detailed proposition to ministers at this point about what the full review would encompass. We had provided general advice in terms of the advice provided to Lord Foster and then through to the Secretary of State in broad terms about the scope of the approved document B, but we had not at this point put forward a specific proposition that this is what the review of ADB might encompass.
Right. So, was the position this, that so far as you were concerned, Eric Pickles' commitment to the coroner was an absolute one, but that in the year since he made it, at least until early February 2014, things had not moved on internally, and there was no ministerial approval of that review?
So, as I said, we didn't have ministerial approval of a specific detailed scope for the review because we'd not put one up. So that is absolutely correct. We were obviously the research that had been commissioned from the BRE, etc., was underway. So there was a bit of a holding position whilst we waited for that research to report. We did not have an explicit discussion about this, but I think if we had, my view would have been that it would have been premature to put up a submission at this point in time to ministers about the detailed scope of that review in advance of knowing what that research was likely to be telling us.
Now let's look and see what Mr. Martin says about this statement in his witness statement to the inquiry. Can we go please to that statement at CLG 3019469, page 14, paragraph 41. He says in the last third of that paragraph, I remarked that this did not constitute an absolute commitment, not least because the statement had been made during the course of one government, and it was known at the time that by 2016 to 17, another government would be in power and would not be bound by the commitments of a previous administration. Is that how you understood his remark? It's not an absolute commitment.
Well, I can see why he's saying that now. I'm now reading that statement in his witness statement, because clearly a new government is not bound by by a previous government. So that is a statement of fact. And certainly if with a new government, we would need to advise new ministers on the commitments inherited from the previous administration and confirm with them as to whether they wanted to continue on with those commitments. And of course, it would have been open for the new government to say yes or no to that.
Yes, indeed. And wasn't that a factor which led you to think that it was of the utmost importance that the issues be resolved quickly and the coroner's recommendations be addressed before another government came in, perhaps of a different political stripe, and undo the commitment?
Well, I would have thought that something like this, it would have been unlikely that a new government would have said, we're going to completely ignore this recommendation and do something completely different.
In which case, why wasn't the commitment absolute, notwithstanding the possibility?
Well, as I say, I can't. I mean, Mr. Martin has explained here why he used that term, and I can see now his reasoning, and he's correct in one sense, that of course a new government could decide to do something different. My view of it would have been that I would have been very surprised, even if it's a completely different government, a completely different hue, that a new government would have completely thrown out taking forward that coroner's recommendation. It might have asked it to be done a different way. It might have adjusted the timeframes. That's obviously something that could have been done, but I would have been very surprised if we'd been faced with that situation.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Chairman, it's now a convenient moment.
Yes, it is. We'll have a short break now.
Okay.
Mr. Ledsome will come back at 3:30. And as before, please don't talk to
course.
anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Millett. 3:30, please. I'll do it then. Good. Would you ask Mr. Ledsome to come back in, please? Thank you. I'll catch them when they're doing it. Right, Mr. Ledsome, ready to carry on, I hope. Good, thank you. Yes, Mr. Millett.
Mr. Ledsome, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'd now like to ask you a little bit about the process for a review of approved document B and your role in that process. Can we look at your statement, please, page 10? And I'd like to go in it, please, to paragraph 32, where you say at the top of the page, the Labour government's Future of Building Control review in 2008 recommended that building regulations should be reviewed on a cyclical rather than piecemeal ad hoc basis. Now, I don't need the rest, I don't think. What intervals are you talking about there?
Oh, gosh. So, from my hazy recollection, I think the idea was that approved documents should be reviewed, I think, on a 6-year basis other than Part L, energy efficiency, which was on a 3-year basis, just because of the priority attached to the Part L reviews, particularly in the context of the zero carbon homes commitment. I believe that was the case.
Right. Now let's look at Richard Harrell's statement, please. CLG 3019487, page 5, paragraph 17. He says here, at the end of at the bottom of the page, decisions on changes to regulatory requirements in the building regulations or to the supporting statutory guidance in the approved documents could only be made through a formal review process. And breaking it down, he says the steps are as follows, and let me summarise them for you as best I can. Developing the initial case and advice for ministers, which set out the scope and need for review. Yes?
Yep.
Policy development in collaboration with an industry working group. Yes.
For which I would read a BRAC working group, but yep.
Right, that, thank you. Commissioning research as necessary to develop or assess technical proposals. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Development of impact assessments.
Yes.
Full public consultation.
Yep.
Preparing drafts of approved documents.
Yep.
Working with the lawyers on any necessary changes to primary or secondary legislation.
Yep.
And then finally, impact assessments and implementing
Yep.
change. Yes. Now, those are the stages. Would those stages be sequential, or could some of those stages be carried out simultaneously?
So some of them could have been done in parallel. So if you could scroll back to the
Can we go back to page
previous
5?
page, please. So certainly, in fact, it would be good practice to do the impact assessment work in parallel with the policy development work, so that there was an iteration between the two, because you actually may want to change policy or take a slightly different view approach depending on what your impact assessment was telling you. So those certainly could be done in parallel with each other, and indeed that's pretty much what we did. So some of it could have been done concurrently.
Nothing else there, I think.
Most of the others, I think it would be quite difficult because they are quite discrete phases of work, and they would need to feed into each other.
Was the policy development and the development of the impact assessments done to some extent in parallel in this review?
So, in terms of reviews, generally yes, but at this point, we were not at the stage of developing specific proposals. Right. Which would have required an impact assessment.
Yeah. And was this formal review process, the stages that he set out and with which you've agreed, contained in any written protocol or guidance?
Oh, gosh. Probably not, actually. It was so ingrained in our way of thinking, so we probably didn't document it, which actually probably would have been a good idea to have done so, thinking about it.
Okay. Were there ever any circumstances in which the formal review steps could be bypassed or expedited, or was it followed strictly and without exception?
Yeah. Sorry, can I just go back to my previous answer? There is a lot of sort of general government guidance on good practice on policy making, which would reflect these stages in broad terms. So it's wrong to say there was absolutely no guidance for civil servants generally on how to do this sort of thing. But we didn't, I don't think, have anything specific for work on on approved documents. I'm sorry that I've lost the thread of your last question.
Well, my next question was whether any circumstances in which the formal review process we've just been looking at could be bypassed or expedited, or was it always followed strictly and without exception?
It would have always been followed formally. There were some phases, as we've discussed, where we had to do things like we had to consult. That was a statutory requirement. But generally, this process is good practice. This is how you would expect and hope policy would be developed.
And a formal review process, according to Mr. Bird, might take 2 to 3 years, and I think according to Mr. Harrell, Richard Harrell, in his statement, he says anything between 18 months and 4 years.
Quite possibly.
Those timeframes are slightly different. Which would you agree with?
Well, I'm going to cherry pick from both, so I would say between 18. Well, I would actually say, I'd actually think that if we got a pretty substantive review done in 18 years, 18 months, we'd have done pretty well.
Right.
And I would suggest also that for the other extreme, 4 years is not, for a big review, is not unrealistic either.
Could clarification of the regulations, or particularly the guidance, that didn't involve changing the wording of the regulation or guidance be achieved by means of an FAQ on the department's website?
Well, I think the issue, an FAQ, so that obviously has to work within the context of the guidance. We couldn't, as it were, make changes to the guidance in an FAQ. It would have to be absolutely foursquare within the terms of the guidance. But
Right.
clearly, an FAQ was a possible option for if it clearly is a just purely answering a question, as opposed to rewriting the approved document guidance, for which it would not have been appropriate.
Does that mean that an FAQ would be a possible option for answering a question, what does X mean?
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Millett. I'm going to have to ask those who are sitting around the room if they're going to speak to each other to do it very quietly, please, because it's becoming a little disturbing to some members of the panel. I'm sorry, start again, Mr. Millett.
On the question of FAQs, was it possible to use an FAQ process to answer a question in a particular paragraph or section of approved document, whatever it is? What does the following word mean? And to define or explain the meaning of the word. Would that be possible?
I don't see why it wouldn't have been possible.
Well, we may return to that.
Yes, I imagine you will.
Now, I want to ask you what has been achieved by the 14th of June 2017. And let's start examining that issue with paragraph 88 of your statement, please, at page 24. And you can see, you say there, in the third line of paragraph 88, this: as well as developing the detail of the policy proposals during this period, there was consultation with in-house legal advisors and analysts. This led to further consideration of the issues identified to clarify thinking. This took longer than originally expected, alongside the need to deal with other issues. Now, what additional delay was caused by those factors?
So this is referring to the overall discussion document. So obviously, the sorts of things that were being discussed and considered there went wider than the ideas and proposals in the discussion document with in regard to approved document B. And given that some of those issues were about the building control system, for example, and we were wanting to explore reforms to the building control system, that's why at that point, it was absolutely right that we discussed our thinking with our legal advisors to make sure that we were not going off on a complete blind alley with anything.
Right. My question is, I'm sorry to cut across you. My question is, how much extra time was caused? How much extra time was lost by the need to...
Well, I'm trying to recall now the position that we had reached. So I believe that the submission that we put up in September 2015 to Minister Wharton included an outline of a possible scope of the discussion document, sort of 2 or 3 page outline, I believe that's the case. And then by the time that we had got to the next major submission, which was later in 2016, by that time we had a more fully fledged draft. It wasn't a fully fledged draft, but it was much more in the form of a draft document rather than a sort of set of headings. So the period between those 2 dates, incorporating within it discussions which we had with Minister Wharton, and which led us to obviously helped us in terms of where things he thought he would want it to address. The need to actually work up what were sort of ideas into something more substantive, and a bit of internal sort of thinking, further thinking. Those are the sorts of things that were happening at that point during this period, in the sort of last quarter of 2015 and the first quarter of 2016, which eventually led to the submission, which is referred to in mid-March.
And what other issues were you considering?
Okay. I mean, this took longer than originally expected alongside the need to deal with other issues.
Yes, what were
sorry,
the
I'm very sorry. So when I wrote this, I think I had in mind that there were a number of other urgent things which both the division generally and myself in particular were having to deal with around the housing and what became the 2016 Housing and Planning Act, which were driven by parliamentary deadlines.
Right. Now, if we go on, please, to page 28 of your statement, Mr. Ledsome, and look at paragraph 108, you list there
Yes.
What actions have been taken in relation to ADB as at the 14th of June 2017, the date of the Grenfell Tower fire.
Yes.
And summarising them, I think they are threefold. Would this be right? Fire safety issues had been included in the building regulations discussion document.
Yes.
And then the second one over on page 29B, research into the usability of ADB had been undertaken and published.
Yes.
And initial drafts of revised ADB had been prepared and submitted to the publishers for a plain English edit.
Yes.
Now, looking back at Richard Harrell's steps for formal review that we discussed a moment ago in paragraph 17 in his statement, if we just have that back on the screen, please. CLG 3019487, page 5. There it is at the foot of the page and over the page. Can you just point out to us where had the review of ADB got to in those steps by the 14th of June 2017?
So it's not quite a question of saying we'd got as far as this in this sequence of events, but what we would have done. So the research.
Well, just going through it.
Yes. So policy development. So that had happened in relation to the ideas in the discussion document, for which we did have there was a discussion in BRAC about. Research, yes, we had done to inform the technical proposals. Development of impact assessments, no, we hadn't done that. That is absolutely right. Preparing draft of the approved documents. Well, we didn't have a final draft of the approved documents, but that work was underway with the plain English edit, and also we had done the usability work as well, just to as a sort of benchmark, as it were, against which to think about the changes that were being made in the drafting of the approved documents. So I think we were in that area, though it wasn't, as I say, quite as you could say we definitely got to this point and we hadn't started that stage, as it were.
Right. Had there been policy development in collaboration with an industry working group?
Well, yes, because there was the BRAC. I mean, there were discussions in main BRAC, and then B, it was a meeting of the BRAC Part B working group in whenever it was, January 2016, I believe, or February 2016.
Yeah, but you hadn't alongside that done any development of impact assessments.
Not at that point in time, no.
So the one thing you could have done in parallel, you hadn't done.
Yes, correct. Now, I think, yeah.
Yeah. No public
Consultation,
No.
obviously. Yeah.
Some work on approved documents, but not the final.
Not the final version. Yeah.
Any work and some work, or no work with lawyers on necessary changes.
Well, the position that we'd have had with lawyers would have been when we had got a final version of the approved document, that we, as I think I mentioned earlier, we would have wanted to have cleared that with lawyers to make sure that we were actually saying stuff that was legally correct and we weren't, as it were, inadvertently or whatever, extending the scope of the regulation. So we hadn't got to that stage either with our legal colleagues.
No, thank you. Now, I want to look at a few matters which occurred in the period October 13 to June 17.
Yeah.
Starting in October 2013, we know that Stephen Williams became the Minister with responsibility for the building regulations on the 7th of October 2013. You may not remember that, but
about that time.
What was the process for bringing a new minister who was coming in not as a result of an election up to speed with current matters such as the building regulations and current topics in relation to them?
So, as I said earlier, it would depend to an extent on the nature of the changes as to whether that process of briefing new ministers was completely, as it were, run through a central process, which would have been organised by our central strategy team, or whether individual policy teams would have in effect sort of briefed their minister in a sort of ad hoc bilateral basis. Now, I can't remember the process for Minister Williams, given that this was I think his first ministerial posting. There would, I'm sure, been some corporate central familiarisation, helping him understand how the department worked, the overall strategy for the department. He had obviously other responsibilities besides building regulations.
Right. Can I ask you to see his second witness statement of the inquiry, please? It's CLG 3034291. There it is. And if we go, please, to page 3, paragraph 6. He says there, I do not believe, although I cannot state with absolute certainty, that I ever read, nor was shown, HM Coroner's Rule 43 recommendation letter. Did you ever show him the letter?
I can't say with certainty that I did.
Right.
I would respect what he says here.
Right. If he's right about that, can you account for it?
Well, I think we probably would have explained to Minister Williams in briefings the recommendation from the coroner's report and how that was being dealt with. But whether we would have actually shown him the letter, that I can't recall.
Was it not of the first importance to show him both the coroner's Rule 43 recommendation and the Secretary of State's response to it?
That was obviously important information. I accept that was important. That was important information. I cannot recall the circumstances in which, or what the exact briefing that he was provided. But I will, I would accept what he said. Accept what he said here.
Now, you refer a number of points in your statement to 7 work streams, and they're described, I think, by Mr. Martin in his statement, and for reference purposes, it's paragraph 45 on page 15, as work streams that he'd commissioned in 2012, reported in February 2015, but because of PERDA before the general election in 2015, and subsequent reading in time for new ministers after that, approval wasn't sought for it until December 2015. That's the chronology he gives us.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
I accept. Yes, I think that's absolutely. I think that's the chronology. That's how I.
Right. Now,
the only thing I would add would comment on that. The only comment I would make on that, and Mr. Martin would have to provide more information on that, is whether there was a period after he received the reports from the BRE where there may have been some toing and froing with the BRE, because there may have been issues on drafts which needed to be clarified. I don't know whether that happened or not. So there may have been a period of time, as I say, where there might have been an iteration with BRE in terms of finalising the research reports. That is not an unusual situation for research reports.
No. Now, I just want to identify the 7 work streams with you, so I can ask a question about them. For our purposes, we have them in his witness statement at paragraph 65 to 81 from page 22. We don't need to look at that because it's lengthy. But in summary, do you agree? Work stream 1 was about periods of fire resistance.
Correct.
Work stream 2 was maximum fire compartment sizes.
Correct.
Work stream 3 was roof voids, cavity barriers, and fire/smoke dampers.
Correct.
Work stream 4, fire protection of basements and basement car parks.
Correct.
Work stream 5, sprinkler provisions.
Correct.
Yes. Work stream 6, space separation.
Correct.
Yes. And work stream 7, means of escape for disabled people.
Correct.
Yes.
Yes, that's
now,
my recollection.
I've just given you a list of the 7 work streams. Can we agree that none of those 7 work streams specifically addresses external fire spread and the dangers posed by the use of combustible materials on buildings over 18 metres?
Not in the way that you've described them to me, and I think that's correct.
Why is
Can I ask you, I think you both need to slow down a little bit.
I'm sorry.
The stenographer's having a little bit of difficulty, I think, this afternoon.
Why is that?
Those were the issues which had been identified in 2012 as requiring further work to understand the details of the particular issue or problem which had come to our attention. So these were my understanding and recollection of these, is that these were technical areas where there are a number of technical questions which needed further work to understand better prior to working out or determining whether we would have needed to make changes to approved document B as a consequence. So these, for example, could have led to significant changes to the substance of the guidance in approved document B, depending on what the research said, and then depending on what options ministers would agree to in terms of taking that forward. So I think that these were separate from, they would certainly, in my mind, they were separate from an exercise of clarification and simplification. The latter is much more, it's a question of getting this right, rather than is this the right thing in the first place. If you see what I mean, the 7 work streams were, well, we don't really know what we need to do about this. We might need to do something very, very significant about it, but we don't know at this point in time. And those 7 work streams were addressing issues in that category, as opposed to a category where it's more about sort of simplification stroke clarification.
Right. From that answer, are we to take it that the 7 work streams, having been begun in 2012, remained separate from the exercise of a full-blown review of approved document B?
Well, they would have fed in. The intention was for those to feed into the full,
right,
depending on what they recommended or what they suggested.
Does that explain why none of those 7 work streams addressed the concerns in respect of the unusual fire spread seen at Lacknell?
I think so. I would have anticipated that if there were issues about the fire spread at Lacknell which were of significantly unusual, that it left experts scratching their heads and really not knowing what had happened there, then that might have been that would have been something that would have been taken account of in new research, or would have been thought about as a matter needing to be researched without understanding the detail of that or the technicalities of that. And I wouldn't want to comment on that. I can assume that it was not felt that that was an area that needed the degree of in-depth research which the areas covered in that programme did.
Why was an extra work stream not added to investigate the first of the coroner's recommendations under recommendation 4?
So the research was commissioned in 2012, so predated the coroner's letter. As I've tried to say, I would have seen a distinction to be made between issues where possibly, frankly, we didn't quite know what the question was, let alone what the answers were. So this is about helping us doing research, which actually helps us understand what the question is. And that would be the sort of research which the 7 work streams referred to were seeking to cover, as opposed to a piece of work which was about taking the guidance that we have, not changing the substance of what is in that guidance, but looking at how it's set out in the approved document, dealing with issues of clarification and simplification. That exercise does not, to my mind now, and would not then, needed then, require the degree of in-depth research that was needed for those other issues. Having said that, of course, you may say, well, what about the usability study? Exactly. So that was a piece of work which we thought would be helpful to ensure that not only did we have the coroner's inquest's view on, whether approved document B worked as a document, recognising that she was particularly focused on section 12, but actually asking a wider group about the document as a whole and whether that works. And that was the usability study. So yes, that was a research piece of work, but it wasn't the same type of research as the research for the 7 work streams. I'm sorry, that's been a very long and convoluted answer, but I'm trying to draw a distinction between these different sort of strands of work.
There are a number of strands in the recommendations. One is usability, as
yeah.
we've discussed, but the other was a specific recommendation in relation to the adequacy of approved document B on external fire spread, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. But what I'm saying is that, or what I'm trying to say, and forgive me if I'm not communicating this very clearly, is that I was certainly not advised that that was an issue which needed the level of in-depth research to determine what was needed to be done, as was the other issues which were covered by the 7 work streams.
I follow, thank you. Now, on those 7 work streams and the research, we don't, I think, need to look at the documents, but take it from me. By all means, disagree with me, please, if this is incorrect. But is it right that your department chased special advisors to ministers for the publication of that research in a period between May and December 2016, and again in January and March 2017?
We certainly chased the clearance of those documents over a considerable period of time.
And did any of that chasing spell out to you in clear terms that without publication of those reports, the work on any review of approved document B couldn't be progressed?
Well, that was certainly a worry.
Yes. And in fact, did that not indicate that the commitment made to by the Secretary of State to the coroner in his letter of the 20th of May 2013 was clearly not going to be met?
Well, it certainly compromised that timetable, yes.
Right. The reports, I think, had been in the hands of the department since February 2015. Why couldn't the department start work on the review of approved document B in the absence of their publication?
Well, we had, because we had got the issues papers which had been drawn up and discussed with the BRAC working group, and we had got the had developed those into questions for the discussion document, which would enable us to then go to a sort of a fuller engagement process with stakeholders. So that had happened, and then alongside that we were doing the work, the plain English edit, for example, of the approved documents. So we were doing things, but the fact that we didn't have the research published necessarily inhibited our ability to sort of progress and pull together all of the various strands of work.
In fact, it's right that the research wasn't published before the Grenfell Tower fire.
It wasn't.
No, indeed published it only in February 2019.
I believe that is the case, yes.
Do you agree that delays in publishing this research were wholly unacceptable?
Well, it was certainly not something that we felt comfortable with, and and it is very unusual for research, any research to take that long to go through a publication process.
I mean, what had gone so wrong?
Well, I don't know.
Did you investigate?
Well, I think you've mentioned the various number of communications that we had with ministers' offices and private offices and SPAD's offices
Right.
to try and get those through the system. I have got no idea why it took so long to get through that system.
From your perspective, was the problem at the minister's end and their special advisor's end rather than the department's end?
Well, I can't comment because I don't know exactly what happened. It was a source of considerable frustration to Mr. Martin and Mr. Harrell. It placed Mr. Martin in quite a difficult position, I know, because as you will know, the fire safety world is quite a small world, and so people knew about the fact that this research was underway. So I know that he was placed in some very difficult situations where people were saying, well, what's going on? What does it say? And he was not able to provide clear answers because he basically didn't have the authority so to do without the research being in the public domain. So it was very difficult. I feel that we tried hard. I feel, looking back on it, then it was escalated because Mr. Quatermain raised it, I know, in discussions he had in some of his meetings with Minister Barwell, who it would got passed through. Why it got held up, I can't say.
Well, we'll come to that communication, I think, in due course in your evidence. Let's move to 2015. Can we look, please, at CLG 1306856? And we'll need the native version of this document, which is an Excel spreadsheet. And it's a forward plan. I'll wait for it to come up on the screen.
Right.
There it is. Now, you can see that, well, you can't see from this, but take it from me, this is sent to you under cover of an email of the 30th of March 2015 by Richard Harrell, and that is at CLG 1006853. I don't think I need to show it to you. But looking at this, you can see that the Part B research, if you look at Part B, the research was due to be completed in the second quarter, the end of first quarter of 2017, yes?
Yeah.
And the review of Part B was due to complete in the second quarter of 2018, yes?
That's what that is saying, yes.
Yes. Would it have been very clear to you at this point, so 30th of March 2015, when you got this document, that Eric Pickles' commitment to the coroner was not going to be met?
I don't think necessarily at this point in time. This was just an indicative forward plan put forward by Mr. Harrell with some indicative resource allocations as a basis for discussing potential options for the forward programme.
Well, indeed, but looking at it on its face, if you compare the commitment made by Eric Pickles to the coroner, which means 31st of March 2017, this document told you that in fact that deadline was going to be missed by a year and a quarter.
Well, there's two comments I'd make to that. The first is that this was based on an indicative staffing allocation, and of course it was open to me and to discuss with others whether that resourcing was right and whether we actually could put more resources into that. So, as I said, this was an indicative plan rather than a final plan. I think that this also reflected a fact that the review of Part B may end up to be quite a longer process. So there may be elements of the Part B review which we could complete, including most particularly the clarification, simplification work in line with the Secretary of State's commitment. There may be then a further work that might be needed thereafter, which is what was being suggested here, taking it beyond into 2018.
Well, there's two aspects, I think, prompt two further questions. First, did you go and ask for further resources so that this plan could be reined in so as to enable government to deliver the promise of a revision to ADB by March 2017?
Well, I mean, it would be quite helpful if you were able to scroll down, because I can't work out from this document as it currently is as to what the sort of overall... is there anything at the bottom of the spreadsheet which talks about the overall staffing position? Because that would help me. Right, okay. Total. 3, 5, 6, 7, 7. Okay. And, sorry, could you just scroll back through, because I just want to check this covers the whole programme. Okay, so this is not counting Part L. Sorry, could you scroll back down? I just wanted to check whether Part L was included in this, and it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not.
So this is Part B, and to some extent, well, all the others as well, as you can see.
Yeah. So I'm trying to, the reason I'm asking these questions is I just wanted to try and think through in my own mind at the point that this was prepared, which was March, did you say 2015?
It came to you on the 31st of March 2015.
And the staffing there, whether that was an actual reflection of resources we had at that point in time or not.
Well, you're the one who, forgive me, raised the question of whether or not this was something which would provoke you to consider whether you needed further resources. So I'm just really interested
yes,
whether you did something about that as a result of seeing this document.
No, but I'm trying to work through in my own mind what this document is actually telling me about the position then. So is it something that is saying this is what we've got and this is what we can deliver with what we've got, or is this actually saying something about whether we need extra resources or not?
Well, let me show you the email then, because it might help.
Okay, thank you.
CLG 100 6853. And it's from him to you, as I say, 30th of March 2015,
okay.
PERDA tasks.
Yeah.
And if you look about 2/3 of the way down the email, he says, I also want to get a slightly firmer grip on work planning for the various teams. Mm-hmm. We are already committed to certain outcomes, and I think it's useful to map out what other pressures / issues might emerge and the resources that might be needed. I've attached a sketch plan that I want to issue to each team, etc. And then he says, C3 Excel files attached.
Okay. So so this is that. Thank you for showing me this, because I think this is helpful to me now to understand. I mean, as you know, this was a bit of sort of blue skies thinking. We were running up to the March 2015 election. The May 2015 election. So where are we likely to be, and what might we need to be doing in resource terms. I think this helps me answer your question, because at this point in time there would have been no decisions on budgets until we knew what the new government wanted to do. Right. So the budget planning process, which would have enabled me to make a bid for extra resources or whatever, would have still been quite a number of months off at this point in time. So thank you, that's right. Helped that.
Can I just cut to the point then, I'm afraid? Did this document tell you that the date of the 31st of March 2017 was very unlikely to be met?
Well, I wouldn't say it was unlikely to be met. It certainly flagged up that there were challenges in meeting that. Yes, I would accept that.
Did you flag to ministers so they were aware of the possible or even likely slippage in the already generous timetable for the completion of the Part B review?
Not at that point in time, because that was at the point at the end of the coalition government, so we would have been something that we would have needed to deal with the new ministers.
Right. Did you?
Well, I think that refers back to the briefings that we provided with Minister Wharton when he took up post later that summer, where we provided briefings, including, I think, in one of the briefings, references to the 2016-17 commitment.
Yes.
That we were looking to include and achieve through the work we were doing.
Yeah, and we'll come to that. We'll come to that shortly, I hope shortly. April 15, so the month after, we see an email from Brian Martin to you at CLG 30192770. Now, Mr. Ledsome, let's look at that. It's dated the 29th of April, and he says,
Yeah.
Bob,
Yeah.
Richard asked me to produce a list of ongoing technical policy issues, now becoming known as the worry list.
Yes.
Attached is the beginnings of the list, which has been partially populated. As always, I'm trying to balance usefulness with red tape. Any thoughts before I get the rest of the technical team to populate it? Now, the list itself is at CLG 3019271, and again, it's in native format. If we can have that up, please.
Yeah.
Now, under Part B, you can see the only issues that are listed are sprinklers, fire spread in timber frame, MMC, extra care housing, fire safety, and ADB infraction risk.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yes.
And if we look closely at timber frame stroke MMC at row 9, you can see that there's a question, what's the issue?
Yeah.
And it's changes in technology relating to thermal performance driving wider use of combustible materials. You
Yes.
see that?
Yes.
Column C, where's the pressure coming from?
Yes.
Insurers, fire brigades, etc., also manufacturers of non-combustible products. What could be done? Introduce a gateway for new tech, viable question, or just keep an eye on things amending ADB as we go. What happens if we don't act? Bigger building fires, exclamation mark. Mostly economic loss, but there are some safety concerns too. Now, first of all, did you read this?
Yes.
You did. Did you ask Mr. Martin about what the safety concerns flagged in this spreadsheet were?
I don't remember what conversations we would have had about it, but I can see from just reading across the sorts of things that he was concerned about with this.
Yeah. Did you know that there were concerns out there in the industry, including bodies like CWCT, that by this time had expressed disquiet about the clarity of approved document B, specifically in relation to the use of combustible materials in modern methods of construction?
I don't believe that there were. I don't believe I was aware of the worries of the CWCT.
Right. Specifically, were you aware more generally that there were concerns in industry about ADB and external fire spread B4, which were not in this list, including the use of combustible insulation materials?
Well, I think that this had possibly been raised in or mentioned in letters from the APPG.
Right.
By this point, so I would, in general terms, but I think at this point in time, there was a worry about a technology that was developing, but I was not aware of concerns raised that there were problems or there were perceived to be problems with the guidance which might compromise the way in which the use of those materials would be managed in building work.
No, just to be specific, were you aware of concerns in the industry about the use of combustible insulation on materials over 18 metres and the use of combustible cladding materials on buildings over 18 metres, including specifically aluminium composite?
I was not aware of
materials with a
specific
polyethylene
concerns like that. The issue had been raised. Sorry, I should also reference back to the discussion which representatives had, or the presentation rather, which representatives of the Fire Protection Association, I believe, had with BRAC in early 2015, when the issue was generally raised, but it was raised as a general issue rather than a specific concern about a specific use of a specific product. I was not aware of concerns about a specific product.
Now, you can see what happens if we don't act.
Yes.
Mr. Martin writes, bigger building fires.
Yes.
Was that not a concern to you?
Well, I mean, of course, that was an issue, and that's why that was the whole purpose of this exercise was to try and tease out those sorts of issues so that we were in a position to register these as things that we would need to address in future changes to the approved documents.
Now, he suggests that what could be done is, as an alternative, keep an eye on things amending ADB as we go.
Yes.
Why wasn't that a possibility?
Sorry, I'm
Column D.
Yes, I can see what he's saying there.
Yes. Why wasn't it a possibility to amend ADB as you go?
Well, we could have done that. When this was drawn up in March or April, spring 2015, of course, we already had the plan in mind for the review of ADB. So I think if your question is, well, could we have done something even more quickly than that? Well, I've accepted that was a possibility, but I think at this point in time we were reaching, or we thought, and we can no doubt discuss whether our thinking was optimistic, that we would be able to pull together the various strands of work to deliver a revised version of ADB within a reasonable time frame.
Did you raise the issues in this worry list with ministers at the time?
Not with ministers at the time, because there weren't ministers in place at the time, because it was at the time of the election. But I think I would need to refer back to the advice. The next stage we put formal advice to ministers was in the advice put to James Wharton. So I'd have to answer that question in relationship to the advice put to James Wharton.
Well, let's look at that. May 2015, we know that the Conservative government came to power, and Greg Clark succeeded Eric Pickles as Secretary of State for the department. Yes?
Yes.
And I think James Wharton was appointed Parliamentary Under Secretary of State responsible for building regulations.
Correct.
Yes. And I think you met James Wharton for an introductory meeting on the 26th of May 2015.
Quite
yes?
possibly, yes.
Yes, we have an email to that effect. Do you remember whether you told him about the Lakanal Coroner's recommendations and the response of his predecessor to that?
I can't remember. It would have been a very high-level introductory meeting. I don't know how long it took. I think I probably would not have mentioned it because, as I say, it was very much I'm in charge of building regulations, you're in charge of building regulations. Let's, say hello to each other. It was that sort of a meeting.
That sort of a meeting. Mr. Wharton says in his statement, second statement at paragraph 29, which is at CLG 303428-9, page 12, as follows, that the current system of building regulations was working well, the number of fires had fallen substantially over the years, and that this was attributable in part to the building regulations. Did you tell him that?
I think that's probably what we may well have included that in the briefing.
Right.
Yes.
But you don't remember telling him about the Lakanal Coroner's recommendations and the Secretary of State's response to it?
No, I don't know whether the comment that you referred to from Mr. Wharton's statement might have referred back to briefing that we provided at the time. But I do not recall that I mentioned at that introductory meeting the Lakanal House fire and the response to the coroner's report.
Now you sent, let's go to CLG 30's19275. CLG 30's 19275. This is an email. Well, it isn't. It's the attachment to an email you sent on the 28th of May 2015.
Yes.
From you to James Wharton, in effect.
Yeah.
And it's entitled "Building Regulations Forward Look."
Yes.
Issue. The Minister requested a forward look at building regulations issues.
Correct.
And at paragraph 5, you say, towards the foot of the screen, we will advise also in due course on issues for building regulations in response to government deregulation policy, including opportunities for further simplification. The timing of this is as yet unclear, however. And attached to the submission was a table, which is referred to on page 1 at paragraph 4. You see that, the attached table, just above.
I see there was a reference to the attached table.
That's where the reference is. Now, we can see the table itself at CLG 30's 19276, the next document in the series.
Yes.
And this is headed Building Regulations,
Yeah.
Key Decisions, Issues, June to October.
Yeah.
And in this, 4 down,
Yes.
the issues is fire safety.
Yes.
You see that?
Yes.
And in the decision column, it says publication of discussion document on technical changes to fire safety provisions in building regulations, particularly changes needed to follow up previous government commitments to the coroner after the Lacknell House fire.
Yes.
Did you provide the minister with a copy of the coroner's letter?
Not with this document, no.
Why is that?
Because this document was intended to give the minister an overview of all of the various issues that on building regulations, which he had looked for to help him start to understand his portfolio. So it was not a document that was seeking his view on how any of those specific issues were going to be dealt with.
Would it not have been helpful for him to understand the background to the need for a discussion document, and given particularly here the fact that you refer to previous government commitments to the coroner after the Lacknell House fire? Why not give him the recommendations and the very government commitments which are referred to?
Well, we could have done that, but the same could have been said about all of these items in this table about further information that could be provided to fill out the decision, the description of the decision, or the timing. So I was asked to provide a short, sharp, concise forward look to give the minister the opportunity to understand the sorts of things that would be coming across his desk in the future. That was the whole point of this exercise, hence the time frame there. It was not a document that was intended to expel out to him exactly what it is that each of these issues and each of these decision points is going to need to cover. We would cover those when we put up the specific advice.
Looking at the right-hand column under timing,
Yeah.
the timing for the discussion document was said to be end June. The previous government committed to taking forward changes needed in response to Lacknell House fire in 2016/17. We would like to issue the discussion document before the summer recess.
Yes.
Were you being entirely candid here about the likely timeframes with the minister?
We were being optimistic.
Yes. So not entirely candid.
No, I don't accept that. I mean, we can have a debate about whether we were too optimistic, and I would accept criticism of being too optimistic, but I think there's a very, very big difference between saying this is what we would like to do, which was what was being said here, and the inference that I take from what you said about us not being candid, which I do not accept.
Right. We've seen Richard Harrell's forward plan Excel spreadsheet, which had the review of Part B, at least on, it looks as if it was current resourcing, extending well into 2018. Why wasn't that clearly highlighted in the key issues
Because,
document?
as I said in our discussion of that was an indicative plan which Mr. Harrell produced with a view, his view, not my view, his view, about the resourcing implications of a wide-ranging plan of work, which were indicative and the basis for a discussion, rather than this is exactly what this is what is going to happen. This is the only thing we can do.
Why didn't you tell the minister that this was an optimistic assessment of the time frame?
Because at this point in time, as this makes clear, we would have been expecting to have put further advice to the minister before the summer recess, i.e. before mid-July, which would have spelled out what exactly we were proposing to do by way of work on Part B. So the detail of how long this might take, the scope, etc., would have been covered in that advice, not in this advice.
Now, in your statement at paragraph 72, you tell us at page 20 that you plan to publish a self-standing discussion document on fire safety in the summer of 2015.
To which this refers, yes.
Indeed, to take account of the research that had reported in the first half of that year, yes?
Yeah.
And to provide a platform for inviting views.
Yes.
The discussion document, I think, is this right, would be to determine the scope of the review.
Yes.
And given that you knew in May 2014 that the guidance in ADB was out of date, as I think's been seen, did you now consider this to be an urgent task, the discussion document?
Well, the discussion document on the way we were expecting to be able to issue that discussion document. If we'd been able to issue it at this point in time, then I think that we would have had the ability to complete the work in terms of what was needed by way of revising ADB to take account of the issues in the discussion document, plus the clarification and simplification work within the 2016-17 timeframe. I was reasonably confident at this point in time, summer 2015, that was achievable. It would have been tight, but I believe it would have been achievable.
Right, okay. Now, you agree, I think, as an important step in the review process, that BRAC would have had to have established a working group to scrutinise and advise on any proposals for review. So far as we can see from the documents, Mr. Ledsome, the proposal to establish a BRAC working group wasn't made until a BRAC meeting in June 2015. Is that right?
If that's what the documents say, then I would accept that.
Yeah. We can look, if we need to, at CLG 30019294, which are the minutes of the 17th of June 2015 meeting at paragraph 8. But would you take it from me that is what it says?
I would, of course, take it from you. That's what it says.
I mean, and you don't have a recollection which differs.
I don't know.
No.
I mean, I'm sorry. It might just possibly help me if you were able just to draw up the relevant section of the minutes, if that's possible, just so I can just see
yes, I can certainly do that.
Reported by way of any discussion at that point. That would perhaps help me.
Certainly. And Mr. Chairman, I should just say one or two questions left on this topic before a natural break point.
Yes, all right.
I'm happy to stop now, but it might leave things hanging in midair.
I'm happy to be guided by you, Chair. But if Mr. Millett wants to continue to avoid a cliffhanger, then I'm happy.
I don't think it's as exciting.
I think we can go on a little bit longer, but I think 5 minutes would be enough.
Oh, plenty, more than enough.
Okay.
But I do want to show the witness.
The
witness wants to see the document, so I have to show him the document. It's CLG 30019294.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you look at the first page, you can see that it's a meeting of BRAC on the 17th of June 2015.
Yep.
I don't think you're present.
Gosh.
Yes, that was my...
No, sorry. The reason for that is that these are the formal members of BRAC plus the formal observers from the devolved administrations. We would not list officials as attenders because officials sort of would come in and out depending on the nature, for their bit of the agenda. So the fact that I'm not listed doesn't mean to say I wasn't there. And if this is indeed the meeting which Minister Wharton attended, then I certainly was there because I remember that. So I think I'm not going to pretend I wasn't at this meeting.
Now, I wanted to show you, because it forms the basis of the question, but page 8, paragraph 10.4. There you have it. It was confirmed that a review of Part B was still planned, though this had yet to be signed off by the new ministers. On the assumption that a review of Part B will go ahead, BRAC members were asked to express an interest in taking part in a Part B working group. And you then have the volunteers expressing an interest. Now, this is the 17th of June 2015, and this is therefore 2 years and 1 month after the commitment made by Lord Pickles to the coroner in his 20th of May 2013 letter. Can you explain why it was that no discussion at BRAC about forming a Part B working group took place in the 2 years to date?
Because at this point in time, we would consider that we had, with the research having reported that we would have a substantial suite of issues, that it was worth forming a BRAC working group to consider with, as opposed to, so that is why we did not feel, it was only at this point that we felt it was worth setting up a specific BRAC working group to help with develop the proposals from the research and turn them into a document which in due course would be issued for public consultation.
I thought you did have the research by this point, did you not?
We did, yes.
It just hadn't been published.
The research had not been published, no, but we would, obviously, BRAC, we would often discuss things with BRAC which had not been published, so we would certainly have not had a problem with certainly discussing with BRAC the findings from the research, and indeed I'm pretty sure there may have been some discussions in main BRAC about the findings from the research as well as in the Part B working group. So, that was the fact that we hadn't published the research would not have inhibited us setting up a BRAC working group.
And when it says the review of Part B was still planned, that this had yet to be signed off by the new ministers, why was that, given the commitment that had been made by the Secretary of State?
Because
the work that had been done?
we were respecting the fact that we did have a new ministers, admittedly pretty much of the same, Conservative government, Conservative ministers, they were different government, and we were respecting the fact that it was absolutely open, though I don't think it would have happened for new ministers to say, we want to do something different.
Had any progress been made with the BRAC working group by the time of the Grenfell Tower fire?
So the BRAC working group met and discussed and commented on a version of the relevant parts of the discussion document. And that was a few months after this. I can't remember the exact date, but there will be documents about that which would have been provided.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think probably is, Mr. Millett. Thank you very much. Well, there we are, Mr. Ledsome. I think we've done enough for today.
Thank you.
I'm sure you feel we have anyway. But I'm afraid we're going to have to ask you to come back
Of
for
course.
some more questions tomorrow. We'll resume, please, at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Of course.
And in the meantime, please don't discuss your evidence or anything to do with it with anyone else.
Of course.
All right? Thank you very much. Would you go to the usher, please? Thank you very much, Mr. Millett. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.